Hello guys, gals and non-binary pals, welcome back to Budget Brew with me, Lotus. Today we're doing Xolatoyac, the Smiling Flood for under $20 TCG market price. And Xolatoya, the Smiling Flood, is 4 green-blue for a legendary creature, Salamander Serpent. It's an axolotl, let's be fair. It's a 6/6. Whenever Xolatoyac enters the battlefield or attacks, put a flood counter on target land. That land is an island in addition to its other types for as long as it has a flood counter on it. At the beginning of your end step, untap each permanent you control with a counter on it. And this can be any type of counter, which we're going to abuse. Before we get into it, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're so close to 400, it would be great to do it before the end of the year. And join the Discord with the link below, and join in all the chats that we do in the channel. And finally, we are sponsored by Pinfinity as our affiliate. Use Lotus for 20% off, and it also supports the channel. And you've got these amazing Ixalan themed pins, serialized card pins, and playmats. So let's get straight into it with some ramp. We have the good old favourites of Cultivate, but we also have Fertilid, which is 2 and a green for a 0/0 elemental that enters with 2 +1/+1 counters. We can pay 1 and a green to remove a +1 counter from it, and target player searches for a basic land and puts it onto play tapped, which we can do technically twice without any extras, but it also untaps each turn because it has counters on it. And Yang Yangu, the Wildcrafter, is a planeswalker, 2 and a green for 3 loyalty. Its static is each creature with a +1 counter on it has tap, add 1 mana of any colour, so that's a little extra rampy there. And for -1 we can put a +1 counter on target creature. We have good old Rampant Growth. Rishkar Pima Renegade says that when this enters the battlefield, put a +1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures, and each creature we control with a counter on it taps to add green. Simic Cluestone, which is also card draw when we don't need it later in the game. Simic Keyrune is a creature with hexproof if we need something in a pinch. And Simic Locket is more card draw in the late game when we don't need this much ramp. And then finally rounding off with Simic Signet. Now we need some card advantage to make sure we keep drawing things. We have Armorcraft Judge, which is 3 and a green for a 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card for each creature with a +1 counter on it. Bred for the Hunt is 1 green and blue for an enchantment. Whenever a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player that we control, we may draw a card. We have Fathom Mage, 2 green-blue for a human wizard 1/1. It has Evolve, so whenever a creature enters the battlefield under control that has greater power or toughness than this creature, we put a +1 counter on it. And then whenever a +1 counter is put on Fathom Mage, we can draw a card. We also have Give and Take. We can also cast both of them if we pay the extra mana of both. So 2 and a green, and we can put 3 +1 counters on target creature, or 2 and a blue to remove all +1 counters from target creature. Draw that many cards. We have Inspiring Call for 2 and a green instant. Draw a card for each creature we control with a +1 counter on it, and then those creatures gain indestructible to end of turn. Instrument of the Bards is a single green for a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a Harmony counter on the Instrument of the Bards, so we can untap it because of that counter. 3 and a green, tap, search your library for a creature card with mana value equal to the number of Harmony counters on the Instrument of the Bards. Reveal it, put it into a hand. If the card is legendary, create a treasure token, then shuffle. Generally, I think we want to keep it on 3, but basically we'll get 2 untaps or 2 uses of it each turn as long as we've got Xolatoyac out. Primal Empathy, 1 green-blue for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card if you control a creature with the greatest power among creatures on the battlefield. Otherwise, put a +1 counter on a creature we control. Either way, it's card advantage or counters to keep untapping them. Zamak Guildmage, green and blue for an elf wizard 2/2. We can play green and blue, This turn, each creature we control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Green and blue remove a +1 counter from a creature we control to draw a card. Now we need some removal to make sure that we're not getting left behind. Essence Capture is a good old counter spell, but we can put a +1 counter on a creature we control. Lux Cannon is one of my favourites in this deck. 4 mana artifact, tapped, put a charge counter on it. Tap, remove 3 charge counters from Lux Cannon, destroy target permanent. As long as we got Xolatoyac out, we can tap it twice in our turn. Oblivion Stone, 3 mana artifact, 4 and tap, put a fate counter on target permanent. So again, those permanents will untap. 5 and tap, sacrifice the stone, destroy each non-land permanent without a fate counter on it. Then remove all fate counters from all permanents. So it's going to help us untap permanents, but also is a panic button when we need it. Quandrix Command, 1 green blue for an instant. We get to choose 2 of the following. Return target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. Counter target artifact or enchantment spell. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. Or target player shuffles up to 3 cards from their graveyard into their library. Reality Shift is a good old exile spell with Resculpt as well. Sometimes you just need to exile something like a Blightsteel or something horrible. Return to Nature, destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, or exile a card from a graveyard. And Ruinous Intrusion, 3 and a green instant. Exile target artifact or enchantment, and then put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the mana value of the permanent exiled this way. So we can make a creature bigger and then get it untapped each turn with Xolatoyac. Xolatoyac is quite expensive, so we do need to protect them. Gaia's Gift is 1 and a green for an instant. We can put a +1 counter on target creature. It gains reach, trample, and hexproof and indestructible to end of turn, so that's great for an expensive commander like ours. Planar Incision, 1 and a blue instant. Exile target artifact or creature, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1 counter on it. Ring of Evos Isle, 2 mana equipment, equips for 2. Sorry, equips for 1, but you can pay 2, and the equipped creature gains hexproof till end of turn. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, put a +1 counter on the equipped creature if it's a blue one. Snakeskin Veil, single green for an instant, put a +1 counter on target creature we control. It gains hexproof till end of turn. Teferi's Time Twist, 1 and a blue instant, exile target permanent we control. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, so we can skip board wipes. If it enters the battlefield as a creature, it enters with an additional +1 counter on it. And then That Which Was Taken, 5 mana legendary artifact that has 4 and tap, put a divinity counter on target permanent other than That Which Was Taken. And each permanent with a divinity counter on it is indestructible, so not only can it untap, it's also indestructible. Now we need to add more counters to make sure so much more is untapping. Agent's Toolkit is a 1 green and blue for an artifact clue. When it enters the battlefield, it gets a +1 counter, a flying counter, a death touch counter, and a shield counter. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, we may move a counter from the Agent's Toolkit onto that creature. And because it's an artifact clue, once it's run out, we can pay 2, sacrifice it to draw a card. Contagion Clasp, 2 mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, put a minus counter on target creature. And then for 4 and tap, we can proliferate. So we can proliferate our counters and that minus counter. Fully Grown is 2 and a green. Target creature gets +3/+3 to end of turn, and then we get to put a trample counter on it. Invigorating Surge, 2 and a green instant. Put a +1 counter on target creature, then double the number of +1 counters on that creature. We have Lifecrafter's Gift, 3 and a green instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, then a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control that already has a +1/+1 counter. Paradox Zone, 4 and a green for an enchantment. It enters the battlefield with a growth counter on it. At the beginning of your end step, double the number of growth counters on Paradox Zone, then create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token. Put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is a number of growth counters on Paradox Zone. Retreat to Kazandu, 2 and a green for an enchantment with landfall. Put a +1 counter on target creature or gain 2 life. Sudden Spinnerets, single green instant. Target creature gets +1/+3 to end of turn, and then we can put a reach counter on it and untap it. So it's great for defense. Now for the creatures that we're going to need to keep untapping. Armored Scrap Gorger, 1 and a green for Phyrexian Beast, 0/3. It gets +3/+0 as long as it has 3 or more oil counters on it. We can tap it to add a mana of any colour, and when it becomes tapped, exile target card from a graveyard and put an oil counter on it. Aven Oddity is a 3 and a blue for a 2/4 flying bird. We can cycle it for 2 and a blue, and if we do cycle it, we put a flying counter on target creature we control. Good old Champion of Lamholt, 1 green for a 1/1. Creatures with power less than this creature's power can't block creatures we control, and when another creature enters the battlefield, we put a +1/+1 counter on the champion. Crystalline Giant, 3 mana for a artifact creature. At the beginning of combat on our turn, choose a kind of counter at random that Crystalline Giant doesn't have on it from among Flying, First Strike, Death Touch, Hexproof, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, Vigilance, and a +1/+1 counter. Put a counter of that kind on Crystalline Giant. So it's just going to get bigger, beefier, stronger, and will untap. Dustshell Crawler, 1 and a green for an insect, 0/3. When it enters the battlefield, put a +1 counter on target creature, but each creature we control with a +1 counter on it gets trample. Flycatcher Giraffid, 4 and a green for an antelope lizard, 3/5. It enters the battlefield with our choice of vigilance or reach counter on it. Foreboding Statue is 3 mana construct. It taps to add 1 mana of any colour, then put an omen counter on it, so we can untap it and get more mana for another turn. At the beginning of your end step, if there are 3 or more omen counters on Foreboding Statue, untap it, transform it into Forsaken Thresher. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, add 1 mana of any colour. It will still have the counters because it's just transformed. Forgotten Ancient, 3 and a green for a 0/3 elemental. Whenever a player casts a spell, put a +1 counter on the Forgotten Ancient. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1 counters from the Forgotten Ancient onto another creature. Iridescent Hornbeetle, 4 and a green for an instant. At the beginning of your end step, create a 1/1 green insect creature token for each +1/+1 counter you've put on creatures under your control this turn. Kirby's Harvest Celebrant, X green for a 0/0. It enters the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. So it'll always come in as a 2/2, as minimum. Remove a +1/+1 counter from Kerberos. Prevent all damage that would be dealt this turn to another target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. So it's kind of protection. Lawscale Coatl, 1 green blue for a snake, 2/2. Whenever we draw a card, put a +1 counter on Lawscale Coatl. One of my favourites is Loyal Guardian, 4 and a green rhino, 4/4 trample with Lieutenant. At the beginning of combat on our turn, if we control our commander, put a +1 counter on each creature we control. Mana Gorger Hydra is one of another favourite. 2 and a green Hydra. Whenever a player casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It's going to get pretty big. Aurum Reef Ooze, 2 and a green, 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, put a +1 counter on target creature, and whenever the ooze attacks, put a +1 counter on each attacking creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. Plaxcaster Froglin, 1 green blue for a frog mutant 0/0. Has graft 3, so it enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it. When another creature enters the battlefield, we may move a +1 counter from this creature onto it. And for 2 mana, target creature with a +1 counter on it gains Shroud until end of turn. Quirion Beastcaller, 1 and a green for a 2/2. When we cast a creature spell, put a +1 counter on Quirion Beastcaller, and when Beastcaller dies, distribute X +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures we control, where X is the number of +1 counters on Quirion Beastcaller. So we don't lose the counters on the Beastcaller if it dies. Scavenging Ooze, 1 and a green for a 2/2 ooze. Pay a single green, exile a card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, put a +1 counter on it and gain a life. Good removal for graveyards. Shield Broker, 3 blue for a Cephalid Advisor, 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, put a shield counter on target non-commander creature you don't control. You gain control of that creature for as long as it has a shield counter on it. So not only do we steal something, it'll untap because it's a counter. Skatewing Spy, 3 and a blue for a 2/3. It has 5 and a blue, adapt 2, so if it has no +1 counters on it, we put 2 +1 counters on it. And each creature we control with a +1 counter on it has flying. Slippery Bog Bonder, 3 and a green for a human druid 3/3 with flash and hexproof. When it enters the battlefield, put a hexproof counter on target creature, then move any number of counters from among creatures you control onto that creature. Good combat trick, good protection. It should be played more. Thundering Nightmare, 4 and a green for a horse spirit with soul bond. It's a 3/3. We may pair this creature with another unpaired creature. When either enters the battlefield, they remain paired for as long as you control both of them. As long as the Nightmare is paired with another creature, each of those creatures has, whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a +1 counter on this creature. Tuskguard Captain, 2 and a green with Outlast, green and tap. Put a +1 counter on this creature, but only as a sorcery. Each creature we control with a +1 counter on it has Trample. Tyrannid Prime, 1 green blue for a Tyrannid with Evolve. So whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, if it has a greater power or toughness than this creature, we put a +1 counter on it. But also this gives other creatures we control Evolve. Undercover Operative, 2 blue. You may have the Undercover Operative enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except it enters with a shield counter on it if we control that creature. So we can control double anything we've got, but it's got a shield counter, so it'll untap. And finally, Wildwood Scourge, X and green for a 0/0. Enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters. Whenever one or more +1 counters are put on a non-Hydra creature that we control, put a +1 counter on Wildwood Scourge. And with the mana base, we're going to need to support the +1 and counter strategy. So we have Llanowar Reborn. It enters tapped, but it taps for a green. It has graft 1, so it enters with a +1 counter. We can either leave it on there to keep it going to be untapped, or we can move the +1 counter when another creature enters the battlefield. Mirrodin Core. We can put a charge counter on it, so it keeps untapping until we can put flood counters on it, or we can just remove the charge counter to add 1 mana of any colour if we're desperate. Novigian Heart of Progress. It's a colourless land, but we can pay green and blue to put a +1 counter on each creature that entered the battlefield this turn. We have a good old Simic Guildgate for dual colours. We have the Monumental Facade. It's going to enter the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it, so it'll untap. It will tap for colourless, or we can tap to remove an oil counter from it, put an oil counter on target artifact or creature we control, activate only as a sorcery, so we can choose something else to keep being untapped. Trenzalore Clock Tower. Add a blue, put a time counter on it. We're not going to use the second ability. It is literally just to put the counter on it, so it's an island that will untap without us having to target it with the flood counter. We have Vivid Creek and Vivid Grove. They'll both enter tapped. One will tap for blue, one will tap for green. They'll both have 2 charge counters on them, so they'll constantly keep untapping with Xolatoyac. And we can tap to remove a charge counter and add 1 mana of any colour if we're desperate. It rounds out with 14 forests and 13 basic islands to complete our mana base. As you can see, the complete deck minus basic lands is $19.69 TCG market price, or €18.07 on card market. What are your thoughts on Xolatoyac? I'd love to see a more ramped up version or non-budget version. What would you do instead? Is there anything that you'd think is a bit silly, like, I don't know, Trenzalore? That's a bit of an odd one to be in there. But yeah, I'd love to see your thoughts on it and how you'd build it, and even some deck lists. But otherwise, thanks very much for watching. Your support is greatly appreciated. Have a great one, and see you next time.